Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next session in our customer webinar series, Using Early Indicators to Augment Prioritization. I'm Shri Sheth, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. As a reminder, this series was created to highlight key resources, trainings, and best practices when it comes to getting the most out of the Vectra platform. Today's webinar will be led by Jonathan Barrett, Director of Consulting Analysts here at Vectra. Jonathan is an excellent resource, and today he'll cover a little bit about MDR, enhancing your workflow, and how to build some use cases. I'll let him share more about that in a couple minutes. Let's cover some housekeeping items before we begin, and then we'll get started. The recording of this session will be shared with you after the webinar. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your console, and we'll address as many as time permits. So keep those questions coming throughout the webinar, and we'll keep answering them either throughout the session or at the end. We've also listed a handful of resources we think you'll find helpful, as well as a quick link to our self-service ransomware demo. And with that, let's get started. Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you, Shri. So just quickly, kind of discussing the agenda for today. The point of this particular presentation is going beyond just the prioritization system that is built within Vectra Detect and finding things that can help either identify malicious actors earlier or provide additional context to your analysts. My team provides the MDR service. I'll talk a little bit about what that is and explain, why we're in such sort of a unique position to see these things and be able to talk about them. After that, we're just going to do a very quick refresher on prioritization within the system. Because we're building and expanding upon that, it's important to make sure that everyone kind of understands how that works. And then from there, we'll talk about the ways that you can build upon that prioritization. A little high level, but sort of wherever you are in your security journey, the tools that you can use. And then we'll go through a few examples and explain how to build these use cases and how the MDR team actually goes about finding these things and testing them as well. Okay. So first up, what is it, MDR? If you heard the term MDR, Sidekick, that is our managed service. So what we are doing is we're providing 24/7 eyes on glass, and we are alerting our customers with this service to things that are going on in their environment that need deeper investigation, trying to find these attackers or poor practice in some cases, things that would make your attack surface larger than you might want. We are a global team in over half a dozen countries now, and we are sourcing these experts in things like cloud and SaaS, network, red team methodology, threat attribution, and we're distilling all that information as much as we can into the service, into our customers. What I really like to say is we are a augmentation of your team. We are an extension thereof, because where we've always seen this work the best is where we're really kind of working lockstep together, helping you understand more about the system, how to manage it, explaining how to do investigations in the system yourself, and us working with you to better understand your environment, your use cases, the technology that you're using, that sort of thing. So what this provides us is a view across all of our customer base, across all the different industries of different activity, either new emerging technologies or new threats, sometimes even old threats that are still lingering. We'll talk a little bit about that as well, and use all those lessons learned to help our other customers. So either in the sense of what we're talking about today, of faster response and to highlight particular combinations of detections, things like that, or just by being able to see something and understand okay, this is part of this technology. This is actually something that we can use to tune the system and make it more efficient for the customer. So this is a new service that you have not heard about yet and are interested. Feel free to reach out to me or to your sales rep. Absolutely would love to have that conversation. So getting into prioritization, most of you should probably be familiar with our quadrants, right? This is one of the key features of our product, where we're not just looking at individual events, we're looking at the combination of behaviors that we see on hosts, accounts, that sort of thing, and using that to direct our workflow. So just to sort of lay the foundation here, right? Detections have threat uncertainty scores. Now, other than one or two cases, no detection is a declaration of maliciousness, just that a behavior exists, right? So a port scan detection, for example, is not saying that a malicious actor is doing a port scan. We're saying that a port scan has happened, and it's happened from this particular host, right? It's the additional context and from other behaviors or through knowing what the system is, that we can make that declaration of this is suspicious, this is malicious, this is benign, right? Something like a scanner, right? If we're looking at Nessus scanners, we would expect to do port scans, right? That is something that we would tune out. The key, what we're doing with today is trying to figure out where those scans are malicious and alert them on that faster. But building off of that, right? The hosts and the accounts themselves also have threat uncertainty scores, okay? So these will change over time dependent on the models that have fired and the behaviors that we see. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's important to recognize that these scores are independent of the detection scores. So it is not, additive or anything like that, where if you have, let's say, 3 detections that are 20 threat, 20 certainty, you're not going to have a host or account score of 60-60, right? It's going to depend on what behaviors have fired, how much activity we've seen across the attack kill chain, that sort of thing. And I bring that up just, I do know this is something that, people new to Vectra sometimes conflate the detection with the host and account. So it's important to recognize that they are separate. Now, what these scores actually mean. The threat is basically if this behavior was malicious, if we know for a fact that it is part of an attack, the relative harm it could potentially impart, right? Where it is within that kill chain. The potential harm from a small port scan is going to be very different than the potential harm of a ransomware file activity, right? So assuming the behavior is malicious, what is the impact? With certainty, this is the probability and how certain we are. Apologies for using the word to just define the actual term, but how certain we are of the behavior matching what we believe to be an attacker behavior. A way I like to look at this is basically if you have an idealized version of what a malicious behavior would be, particular of that type, how closely that resembles that sort of idealized malicious behavior. Alternatively, if you sort of look at it as like, if we've learned what is normal in the system, how far this particular detection deviates from what we've learned as normal, okay? Now, those are driven by different factors depending on the behavior. So something like exfil is going to be driven more by the amount of data sent out, while something like, let's say, port scan is going to be driven by the number of endpoints hit. Now, each of these detections has a maximum lifespan, right? Lowest is a few days. I think now we actually have a couple that are a little over a month, but so we're going to say roughly a month here at maximum. And during that time, that is when those behaviors contribute to the host or account score, right? Once that time ends, it will no longer contribute. But those detections will remain active as long as we're seeing activity, right? So even though a detection itself, let's say, has a lifespan of a week, if we're continuously seeing the same activity there, and it's something that we deem that we want to continue to load upon, that detection will remain active beyond that week. However, once the activity ends, it will take that week for the detection to become inactive and no longer contribute to the host or account score. And what you'll see is, as time passes without additional behaviors and additional activity, is that host and account score will slowly degrade its score, right? Basically, time has passed, we're not seeing anything new, you haven't actioned it, so we're sort of making an assumption that it's something that you're aware of and are okay with, or at least only monitoring, right? Until everything becomes inactive, okay? But it's not just, how many detections there are, right? I mentioned this before. It's what categories, what type of behaviors within those categories. We look at things like repetitiveness of the detection to help figure out where in these quadrants these hosts and accounts should be. So, using on the left here, like if we just have 3 port sweep detections off the same host, and let's say, those are 20/20 threat uncertainty, again, it's not additive, but, it's not going to be a 60/60 threat uncertainty on the host. Because we're only seeing port sweep, because it's repetitive, because it's been going on a while, we're actually going to say, the threat itself is probably relatively low. We're not seeing progression. But the certainty of what we're saying, what we're seeing, is higher, right? So to make numbers up, maybe the threat would be 20 and the certainty 80. That is very different than what we have on the right, which is we have command and control, particularly external remote access, one of our advanced command and control models. We see reconnaissance. We also see lateral movement in the form of suspicious remote execution, which is one of our more, sort of targeted lateral movement detections as opposed to something like automated replication. That together is going to be scored higher. The threat itself is going to get pushed up because we're seeing this. Certainty, because the certainty of detections are low, maybe a little lower. We still may put it into the critical, or here we would definitely still put it in the critical quadrant, but we might put it a little lower in the critical quadrant based upon some of that information. But it gets even more complicated than that. And we do all this behind the scenes for you, so you don't have to worry about it. But we recognize that these different patterns, it's not just, command and control, reconnaissance, lateral, but we recognize that different types of attacks or different types of activity are going to exhibit different behaviors. So looking at like a crypto worm here, right? Something like crypto mining is going to happen. It's going to try to spread. So we're going to see port sweep. We're going to see internal darknet scan as it tries to find vulnerable services. If it's using an exploit, or maybe it's going to be trying to use default creds. It's going to do that sort of scanning. We also expect it to do scanning outside of your network, right, as it tries to spread beyond your environment, outbound port sweep. And then once it finds systems that it believes are vulnerable, or at least could be, automated replication as it sends the same payload to those destinations, right? So this is very indicative to us of botnet-like behavior. Even without the cryptocurrency mining, this fast spread is very akin to what we see with a lot of worms and additional botnets. Which, if we're to take like a crypto worm, and we'll go all the way back to WannaCry, you see on the far right there, like it's the same sort of activity, but we also see file share encryption, right? So we have ransomware file activity. This, while yes, a worm, is looking more like actual ransomware. Hence, that's why we highlight it as. And these are detection profiles that we actually put within the host page, right, to help explain this, right? Based upon the behaviors that we're seeing, it looks like this type of activity. And then even that here, from a detection profile standpoint, like let's look at external adversary. This is very different, right? We have command and control. Not that we wouldn't necessarily have some command and control with some botnets or like the ransomware crypto the ransomware worms, but this is more akin to someone actually making controlling the system manually, right? So again, an external adversary. You have external remote access. You have scanning as they try to move across your network. It's not just a spread, go find systems that are vulnerable and then go try to exploit them or use default credentials, right? They're being more meticulous. They're probably being slower as well, right? So privilege anomalies, suspicious no execution, on until, ideally you would stop them before this, but, exfiltrating data, right? Smash and grab data smuggler. So we recognize, all this within our prioritization, and that, that is, core to how MDR responds, but how we suggest that you use the system too. But we also want to enhance our workflow, right? We are trying to provide, high fidelity indicators, and that is why we're looking at this sort of pattern of this combination of behaviors. But, if you're willing to sort of deal with a little bit more of a threat hunting approach, something that requires a little bit more investigation and a little, I would say, FP tolerance, right? We can enhance this workflow. So, the behavioral approach provides future proofing, which is great. We've consistently seen for any new, ODA that's being used, like we still have coverage, right? That exploit is still going to be used as part of an attack that is going to be used to achieve an objective, right? So all the behaviors that I just showed you, like with external adversary, still hold true, right? But, what we want to do then is, well, where can we label stuff? Where can we say, this is, this particular exploit? And this is where things like custom models come in. But, those, IOCs, custom models, whatever, there's potentially more nuance there, right? So you have to be willing to accept the sort of threat hunting approach if you're going to use it for alerting. But on top of all this, too, we recognize that, you have other additional, concerns, right? We are looking, at attacker behaviors, but maybe in, your environment, you've been tasked with trying to identify, rogue devices, right? Maybe you've been tasked with trying to identify like unauthorized SaaS usage, right? This is where this approach that we're about to talk about really comes in handy for finding these things. And really, you've probably, seen this slide before and heard this term used differently from Vectra. But on top of all that, right, there's this no free lunch theorem, which basically, states that, there's no one algorithm that is going to outperform in all cases, right? So what we're suggesting here is that within your environment, there are probably stronger indicators than in someone else's environment. Same thing, but the fidelity in your environment is higher for a particular custom model or for a particular pattern that we're going to talk about. Okay, so when that's the case, why not use that for alerting purposes, right? This is sort of the opposite, if you will, of what, of triage, like within the system, right? You're saying within the system that this is authorized activity. So, I want this suppressed from scoring. You're still, with custom filters, you're still having the detections in the system. So you can still use it for investigative purposes, but it's not necessarily contributing to the host or the account score. What you're doing is sort of the opposite of that. And this is, the sort of takeaways are what we do within MDR as well to, as we're working with customers to identify what is impactful and meaningful to them, to be able to alert to things a little faster and with a bit more clarity. All right. So how to implement this though? Easy solution, threat intel, right? This is something that's built into the system. This is not getting into the pattern matching so much as we're going to be talking about, but if you have indicators, maybe you're using honey tokens or something of that nature, right? You can put your own threat intel into the system and then create alerting based upon that, either through email notification, syslog, that sort of thing. Another great example here, if you're allowed to within your own region legally and by policy, like particular users you may decide that you want to focus on, right? Maybe they're about to be laid off, or maybe they've been reported for suspicious behavior, and you want to monitor them a little more closely, right? This is a great way that you could do something like that by putting in user accounts to see, okay, where are these people accessing the network, right? You can also use recall custom models, right? This is something that my team heavily uses as we're working with customers and finding things that are important to them that maybe outside of the normal malicious actor use cases, but also when we are doing our threat hunting. So if we know that there's a new exploit that's been released or new vulnerability disclosed, right? What can we do to help alert upon that? And custom models is typically the way that we're going to do it. We did it with Print Nightmare, Log4Shell, basically anything that's coming out. If we're able to create a custom model, we will, and set that as our high priority alerting. If you have Stream instead of Recall, you can do this as well. Stream affords you the ability to use your own data lake and the additional data that you're providing to enhance the detections or enhance the metadata that you're using to investigate. So a lot of opportunities there. But also your SOAR platform, right? Or if you're just using a SIEM, if you're getting the information from Vectra into one of these systems, you can then use additional alerts from other security tools, additional logs that you may have, and be able to say, like, okay, in the case of this particular model, look for these logs, and if this matches, give me an alert or highlight this alert a little higher than you normally would. Now, I recognize that a lot of organizations aren't doing full automation yet, or I shouldn't say full automation, but using a lot of automation yet in terms of SOAR platforms. And as I mentioned before, like wherever you are in your sort of security journey, there are options here. Even if the only thing you take from this presentation is sort of aspirations, that's fine, right? But recognize that there are these sort of intermediary steps you can take along the way, and you don't have to start at the very end, like with the SOAR. You can work your way up to it. But let's talk about building out the use cases, all right? First of all, what's the process? And for any sort of event that my team's looking at, whenever we do investigations, particularly when we know that something is a malicious true positive, we dig into it. We do after action reports, and we basically follow this process, right? Identify the use case, which is whatever the scenario is that we're writing the after action on, right? From there, we identify potential indicators. We then test those indicators, and then we iterate upon that until we find what works for us, right? And we can do this either at the scale level across all of our customers or for individual. And I'll point out a few places around or in the following slides of where your approach or where your sort of acceptance level of a certain fidelity or noise is different depending on the scale that you're working at. So let's start with some very basic use cases, all right? So anonymous access and configure, all right? So for anonymous access, basically what we're looking for is someone that may be trying to circumvent our security tools by using some software that will basically proxy their connection to the open internet, hiding the destination that they're actually trying to get to from us, as well as people that are using anonymization tools when they're accessing our environment, our accounts. And then with Configure, Configure is pretty old by now. There might actually be people on this call that don't remember when that first came out. If you're one of those, please go look it up. Definitely security history right there. But we're still seeing this active in some environments. Anywhere with sort of older systems, embedded systems, that sort of thing, manufacturing, healthcare, this type of thing still pops up. If it's not Configure, it's another old worm or software that isn't heavily used anymore. Things like Poison Ivy are still active, as well. But if we want to look for these use cases, if these are our use cases to alert, outside of prioritization, how do we do that? Well, let's identify these indicators, okay? So for anonymous access, this can be fairly simple, right? We have two detections out of the box that are highly useful with this. So Tor activity for detect for network, and then for detect for O365, Azure AD Tor activity, right? So with detect for network, if a user in my environment is using the Tor browser or using the Tor network, we have a detection for that. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a anonymization software that basically it proxies connections through multiple nodes to hide the destination and the source from people along the way. So from your perspective as the company, all you can see is the connection from the user to that first hop. You won't see where they're actually trying to get to on the internet. Likewise, that website that they go to will only see the last hop in that network chain. They won't see the originating IP of your user on your network, all right? So we can highlight these, and these by themselves, would put only put a host or an account in the I think low and medium quadrant respectively. So, and this is understandable. It's not, we're not seeing a lot of malicious activity. There are reasons to use Tor that are legitimate. But there's no additional suspicious behaviors. But possibly in your network, this is something that you actually want to alert upon every single time. You want to hunt this down because you're saying that there is no reason. So either through the ways that we were talking about, email notification, syslog out to your SIM, use of the API, et cetera. You can grab this and say like, okay, alert me every single time, and then I will go investigate. I have a higher tolerance for these detections in terms of the number that I need to deal with. That's okay. I'm okay with it not being in the higher critical quadrant. Okay. But going to where why this is sort of a gray area. Talking about that fidelity and the number of detections is this is going to be highly dependent upon your environment and on your industry. I can tell you I consistently see things like Tor activity in higher education, right? Students with their newfound freedom, they just kind of do whatever they want. A lot of crypto miners getting installed in labs or installed within dorm rooms, but also the use of Tor, right? So in that environment, it may be okay. It may be something that you don't want to hunt down every single example. You have to kind of come to that conclusion yourself, and we'll walk through like our process of determining sort of acceptable noise level. Then with Configure, again, fairly simple. Suspect domain activity, where the TLD is WS. This is one of the things that we highlight in our backend system to all of our analysts to go investigate so that they can provide the details to our customers. And I've yet to actually see this false positive, but at the same time, WS is an actual TLD. I think Samoa, I think it is. So there are probably examples where this will not be a configure. However, it's shown itself to be high enough fidelity for us at scale that we're working on, which is quite large, that we're okay with that. And I would just assume in your environment, you would be as well. But now, those are basic use cases. So, the amount of testing that needs to go there, we still follow the same pattern, but there's not much that need to be iterated on. But to test these, right, we start with our hypothesis, right? We have our use case, we have our indicators that we think are meaningful. That is our hypothesis. We then collect all the matches to this, things that we find, and we're going to make the assumption that they're all false positives, right? We're going to try to avoid our own cognitive bias and say, all right, let's assume whatever comes back initially is going to be noise and prove otherwise. From those matches, we're going to try to identify patterns. And this may be things like host names, IP ranges, port and protocol. Depending on what the behaviors that we're looking at, all those become potentially meaningful. And we'll show that a little bit in the following use cases. Then, once we have that information, we basically will reassess the indicator until acceptable. So, we may find that our initial, sort of broad approach of saying okay, all Tor activity is not actually useful for us. Maybe there's part of a network we don't fully control. Maybe guest Wi-Fi, whatever the case is. So, all right, well, we know that we want to shrink this down. All right, let's ignore guest Wi-Fi, right? That's a very simple sort of alteration to that original indicator that may provide greater fidelity for you in terms of actionability. All right, so let's make this a little bit more complicated in terms of use cases. Let's talk about those rogue devices. So, this is a prime example of one of the investigations that we've done before and we're able to alert customers to. So a new device is put onto the network. This was actually placed in a data center, and immediately Detect popped up and said, as soon as we're seeing traffic, hey, novel MAC address. Shortly thereafter, we start seeing scanning. And actually what ended up happening here too was accounts are starting to get locked out. So, just like we'd expect, in Detect, we have detections. Port sweep, port scan, SMB account scan, SMB brute force. These may differ a little depending on the device that's left behind. But in this particular example, this is what we had, right? So, looking at this, an analyst can go and see the details and say, okay, this is definitely suspicious. Follow-up is needed. We need someone to go, to that data center, that sort of thing. But can we identify that in a more automated fashion, saying hey, this, immediately raise this as a flag, right? Without as much need for interpretation. So, we may start out here with saying, okay, well, novel MAC vendor. That's a security insight. For those of you who aren't familiar, security insights are info detections in our Detect platform that basically said, it by itself is not a strong indicator of compromise, but it's very useful context, right? So, maybe at this point you're saying, well, I disagree. I think novel MAC vendor is, a great example of something that I want to be alerted upon. Well, the problem is, you start looking at this, well, wow, there's actually quite a lot that are going on in my environment. People kind of forget just how many different manufacturers there are, and particularly when you're dealing with a lot of embedded devices and things of that nature, you can have a lot of one-offs. So, all right, clearly during our testing, we found that this is not by itself a strong enough indicator. Well, what can we do? Again, we iterate. So, in this in a particular example, you can say like, well, all right, well, what about Raspberry Pis, right? We provide the vendor in there, and we can do searches and say like, well, how many of these actually come back for Raspberry Pi? In most cases, that's going to be a fairly low number, and that actually might be a good indicator. However, that doesn't necessarily still address the full case, what we're trying to do here, right? If we're looking for rogue devices, we want more than just Raspberry Pi, particularly if these are rogue devices that are potentially doing something malicious. So what we start looking at is like, all right, well, we know that there are behaviors there. Let's start there. And that's exactly what we did. So we didn't limit this by Raspberry Pi, but we do have another call out, internally for that. We said, all right, well, any novel Mac vendor that does reconnaissance. And that has been very successful from our standpoint of identifying a lot of these type of incidents. Recognizing that, maybe we can catch this a little sooner, or, we don't necessarily want to be reliant upon solely reconnaissance. We may actually be able to expand this out to command and control. Now, for us, at the scale that we're working on, we found command and control doesn't really work well, mainly because, again, those embedded devices, you have a lot of vendors that have connections back to their own infrastructure. So those tend to pop up. So we stuck solely with reconnaissance. But in your environment, you may actually find that there's very few of those embedded vendor devices. So something like command and control actually is meaningful. And you could say, hey, if this starts doing any reconnaissance or any command and control, any of these models, like highlight this to me, right? And again, this would be like within your SIM, SOAR platform, anything like that. But as you're building this out, there might be other stuff that you want to call out. I mentioned that we have a separate call out for Raspberry Pi. We have other call outs for other different tools. Things like network storage devices. Typically, not that they're uncommon in a lot of environments, but when we see something with a novel Mac vendor and we know that it's related to some sort of network storage, like that raises an eyebrow a bit more. So that's something that we want to investigate. All right, let's get this even more complicated. So RansomOps. So this is a composite of a few events we've unfortunately seen a lot of this over the past couple of years. People, it's in the news. So I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anyone. And we've worked with a bunch of customers and sometimes even non-customers at different stages. Where we're not coming in, or we're not being brought in until after the fact, and maybe they're able to stop things a little early. Maybe they weren't. To us working as actual part of MDR and alerting much sooner as part of this. But let me walk you through everything being equal, like what this would sort of look like. So initially there's this external reconnaissance. In a lot of the cases that we saw is sourced from Russian IPs, typically the same ASN, but scanning things like webmail, VPN, that sort of thing. And after that, basically, there's some headway time. They then exploited the, in this case, the VPN. It may be some other externally facing server. In this case, the VPN. And as soon as they started doing things, within a couple minutes, they start taking actions, and we see detections, right? And as these things pile up, this is definitely getting pushed up into, the medium to the high quadrant. But we don't see ransomware yet, and therefore, maybe we don't necessarily have a good idea, yet of what's actually going on here. We know something has a lot of velocity in their detections. We know, it's across different categories and stuff like that. But me as an analyst, particularly if I'm a tier 1 analyst, may not understand the consequence there yet. As they're going on, they're conducting additional reconnaissance. Again, we have detections, that sort of thing. Interesting in this case, because it's VPN, their DNS traffic was actually being routed through the customer. So we were able to actually see lookups to things like yandex.ru and a number of other RU sites. If I recall correctly, in this case, I think we even saw them looking up a few exploit databases, which made it pretty clear, like what was going on there. And as time progresses, we see things like the novel admin share that's in our security insight as they access shares that aren't typically accessed. Malicious tool copy, moving sort of the default name of attack tools across file shares. What we're seeing a lot of this is they're not taking the time to obfuscate. But then they begin, creating the domain controller. They then, move to the domain controller, RDP, try exfil data, and if they're successful, right, that's data smuggler smash and grab, and finally encryption, ransomware file activity, right? So there's a lot here, right? And me as a analyst, I can see that and recognize like, okay, something is definitely going on, but what we want to do is try to alert upon this as quickly as possible, because what you can see here, right, is there's this ever sort of crunching amount of time, right? Like it starts out over 6 days, then over a few hours they're doing the reconnaissance, and then they move very quickly. Once they have all the data that they want or the information that they want, they move, they exfil, they encrypt. And of course, this is going to be happening at Friday night, Saturday night, where they expect people are paying less attention. So let's quickly talk about some of these indicators. I'm going to work backwards here, right? And all of these are going to be sort of dependent upon your environment. I suggest that you sort of take the methodology that I talked about before and, test this sort of thing. So, doing the file share enumeration, we expect that detection, but also adding things like, hey, with this file share enumeration, security insight of novel access to SMB admin share, along with any privilege anomaly detection, I want to be alerted. I will say that across our customer base and at the scale that we're working on, this is a little noisy. For an individual environment, this may be better, but something to keep in mind. The data exfil, right? This is where having a strong policy as to like where data can be exfilled and blocking alternatives is really critical for a preventative standpoint. But we've seen these actors, I'm talking like Conti, DarkSide, etc., use sites like Mega Upload, so Mega.com, Tim.sh. Not that these don't have legitimate purposes, they do. But in most environments that I've worked in and I've seen, from a corporate standpoint, this is very uncommon, right? So these are things where, all right, for a data smuggler, for a smash grab, these particular domains, I want to be alerted upon. I'm going to block them. I'm going to block it at the firewall, but I at least want to know if someone's attempting, right? So not only just data exfil, but maybe even saying any sort of DNS request to here. That would likely be fairly noisy, but it's an option. I label this under DC sync. Really, this is any sort of AD information gathering, but during the replication, during these attack phases, there's a fairly common call, and we have a model that does this, right? So RPC target recon, it's looking for these sort of one-off RPC queries that don't happen very often. So in particular, this is the DRS get NC changes. So basically, requesting an update from the domain controller to give me the AD information. And this works fairly well. If you're of the more paranoid sort, right? You also have recall, and you can do the same sort of thing in stream, where specifying like, okay, this operation, if this is called, like I want to be alerted upon it. I highly recommend that you remove domain controllers from this query, and you can do that multiple ways. My general recommendation would be, if you're to set this up as a custom model, create a triage rule for it, because what that allows you to do is you can use groups within detect to triage out that detection, and you don't need to copy those details into your query, right? But again, this has been fairly successful, and even in cases where it wasn't something like DC sync, it's been highly useful for detecting previously unknown domain controllers, right? So from our perspective, things that aren't labeled. From your perspective, if there's a data center move or something like that, highlighting that quickly, so you can say whether or not this is authorized and you want to tune it out, or if it's a rogue domain controller, let's say, and you need to go take action. And then continue to move, closer to sort of the start point, right? There's a custom model, Cognito TTV SMB. This should actually say malicious tool file copy. As I mentioned, oftentimes we're not seeing the file names obfuscated, so that allows us to search for those names within recall and alert upon that. This unusual DNS lookups, this is probably where the most nuance is, in the sense of, in your particular environment, you may have dealings with countries like Russia, while another customer or another company, doesn't, right? So depending on how common some of these destinations are, you could alert upon this, or at the very least use it as context, right? If I start seeing, reconnaissance activity, let's say from a host, and also request for, yandex.ru, google.ru, that sort of thing. And, I know for a fact that, there's no reason for this user to be, going to those sorts of sites. That raises my interest. That's something I'd want to investigate. And then going into command and control, whether it's TeamViewer, whether it's Cisco AnyConnect or anything like that, once those tools are used to actually take actions on machines, we expect things like hidden HTTPS tunnel, external remote access. For your individual environment, if you have this is the tool that we use, setting up alerts for the other ones can be highly beneficial. Oftentimes in a lot of environments, we see that that's not the case, and people use basically whatever they want, or there isn't a strong policy. So this becomes more informational, but it's something that you can label on the system, right? Like regardless of any other detection, and say like, hey, someone at least is trying to access this service. That can be very useful. And then lastly here, Vectra Threat Intelligence Match, things for Cobalt Strike. These are typically websites that have been compromised at one point. Maybe they're running cPanel as part of some shared service provider, and a whole bunch got compromised and started being used as either command and control or as a malware staging location, right? Using these, particularly in conjunction with other command and control, has been very useful in terms of early identification of these sort of attack paths. So with that, and I realize we're actually running a little long, but I wanted to kind of highlight the things that we've seen as part of MDR, as well as sort of give some insight into how we approach the problem. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. We did have a couple questions just come in. One was earlier. This is asking, is MDR building on a supported EDR as a precondition?
So right now for our MDR, we're solely Vectra focused. There's definitely interest in looking at some EDR opportunities, but not today.
Awesome. Thanks for answering. This next one is a little bit of a scenario. So we currently use a third party for 24/7 SOC augmented with a small internal team. Our team uses Vectra tools today, plus other tools in our stack. How might MDR services fit in this model? Would MDR potentially relieve, reduce, perhaps what the internal team does?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we have a whole, basically every scenario when it comes to working with different teams and security teams, we have, right? So we have teams that are highly active in the system and like us just as sort of like as a sort of watchful eye and highlighting things. We have others that we are the predominant user of the actual system and just alerting things. But we also have customers that they have third parties as well that we interact with. So whether that is us giving the escalations to them or taking questions from the other team and helping them do investigations within the security tool. So we definitely fit all types.
Awesome, thank you. And if folks have questions around the use cases that Jonathan was presenting and walking through, or other questions around MDR, feel free to message Jonathan or any of your customer success managers on our Slack community. And if you're not a part of that, I'm just typing this in right now, you can email me at sjeff@vectra.ai to join the community. You should have gotten notified in the Q&A box there, and we can continue conversations over in Slack. So you get access to product management, consulting analyst team, customer success managers. The whole Vectra team is there to support you in anything that you're facing each day. So I think with that, Jonathan, we're good to go. Questions have been answered unless anyone has a few more. We'll give it a couple seconds. Awesome. Thanks for your time, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to hear from you on Slack.
Sounds good.